Good afternoon. For those of you who I've not met, my name is Alison de Lima Green. I'm curator of modern and contemporary art here, and my formal title is the Isabel Brown Wilson Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. It's always a real pleasure to think back on Isabel and what she and the Brown family have done for the museum over the many years, and how much I wish I could walk her through the Francis Bacon exhibition. This exhibition was organized by the Centre Pompidou, the Musée National d'Art Moderne, Paris, in association with our institution. It is supported by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities, and major support has been provided by the Anchorage Foundation and our very good friend, Bobby Now, with additional funding provided by Gilbert Lloyd, Chairman and CEO of Marlborough International Fine Art Limited, the gallery that for many years supported Francis Bacon during his life, the National Endowment for the Arts, Luther King Capital Management, Sarah Pascal Dodd, Sylvia Wolf, and Carl Niendorf. And most importantly, this exhibition is supported by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities. Please always remember not to take our government support for the arts for granted, and get out there and get behind the governments that support the arts. On a more personal note, my heartfelt thanks go to our partner at the Pompidou, curator and deputy director Didier Ottinger, to Gary Tintereau, the Margaret Alcock Williams Chair and director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, as well as to the extraordinary exhibition team led by Deborah Roldan, and thanks to Margaret Mims, who is responsible for today's lecture and all the great lectures you hear here. I'm going to do two more little promos for upcoming lectures. Next Thursday, I will be back here again, Thursday evening, with two artists, Wyatt Gallery and Emily Schur, who are part of the Four Freedoms Project, the thoughtful restaging of Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms iconographic paintings in light of contemporary issues. This promises to be a wonderful talk, free and open to the public, so do come back again if your schedule allows. And then on April 19th, I'm very excited to confirm that in conjunction with the Francis Bacon Show, we have enlisted the great poet Nick Flynn to give a reading. Nick has faced with an unblinking gaze some of the same issues that we see in Bacon's work as well. And this is in celebration of the new anthology just published by Zud Books, wonderful new press spearheaded by our very good friend Michael Zilka. So mark your calendars for Sunday, April 19th as well. And you think you wouldn't need to be reminded, but during Didier's beautiful talk, just as he was getting to the summation yesterday, someone's phone rang. So please do remember, set your tasers on silent. And remember, if you have to check a message and it's urgent, do so as briefly as possible. We have this wonderful stadium seating created by Mies van der Rohe, but that means that if you're in the third row and you're looking at your phone, you're interrupting the line of vision for everyone standing or sitting behind you. So do please be courteous of that. And so on to the first slide that you see here. This is a young Francis Bacon captured in 1960. Of course, my definition of young has changed. He's 51 here, mere baby, captured by the great portraitist Cecil Beaton. And Francis Bacon was extremely conscious of how to craft a public persona. We owe so much to how he not only presented his work and I'll be going into that in more detail, but also how he presented himself to a public, and a kind of dual consciousness that always was with him as he was openly gay, made the queer subject matter central to his work, and yet did not allow that to be discussed in detail during his lifetime. We have so many toys here. Our own exhibition starts with this great self-portrait. And some people have asked me about this, so yes, I will confirm the glazing and the gold frames that you see on all the paintings in the exhibition were very much Bacon's desire. He wanted to see his paintings presented with the same majesty as old masterworks, and he felt that the glazing also gave a certain dignity to the work and protected their extremely delicate surfaces. So sometimes you will actually see yourself mirrored back in Bacon's own image, something he never minded, although with more sophisticated museum glass now that's not always the case. The portraits are all almost small, these headshots. We have a group that range 20 years in date. It's a little deceptive when you walk in the first room because you might think they're all from the same period. But they all have this wonderful touch and in a microcosm tell you why Francis Bacon is such a good painter. And the immediacy and strength of these compositions that are built out of an experience and deep understanding of Cubism in particular, as well as photography. And this painting, I think, particularly captures his incredible eye for almost photorealist detail, and yet the bravura paint strokes with which he deconstructs flesh and face before you. Indeed, on occasion, before he would start a self-portrait, he would paint his face in order to heighten the contrast. And in choosing his portrait subjects, he said, I always want my subjects to have high cheekbones. I need that to work from. This is the studio environment he worked in. It was a mews, i.e. an old stable, that he filled with everything that fed his work. What fed his work were news clippings, photographs, images of his own painting, memoirs. And you see, he used his walls, sorry, it's hay fever season, to clean his brushes. And if you looked just at the walls, you would think he would be a very different kind of painter than you actually see. The walls are full of bright, immediate primary and secondary pigments. What was one of the great talents that Bacon brought to his work, and particularly in his later years, was a wonderful sense of how to mix paint, how to layer pigment, sometimes dry mixed with wet, sometimes oil, sometimes acrylic, sometimes brushed on, sometimes sprayed on, literally with an aerator, sometimes with material like sand or dust picked up from the floor and rubbed into the canvas, but always with this incredible sense of when to pull back from it going too extreme. And here are just a couple more views. You see here reproductions from one of his tear sheets from one of his catalogs that have been on the wall in the sunlight so long they have faded to bright blue. And for those of you who like the sort of necrophagy of going to a particularly carefully restored studio, this actually exists as you see it now at the Hugh Lane Museum in Dublin, the city where Bacon was born, although I think he'd find it certainly ironic that this sort of memento mori is preserved in a city he left as soon as he could. And you see how he stockpiles again and again these mementos, and we'll return to this image right here, but I find it particularly touching that this photograph of George Dyer the man who was his companion for much of the 1960s until his death in 1971, remained on the top of the pile of images. We'll pause for a second. Those of you who are looking for seats, there are many seats in the first two rows, so please feel free to come down. And latecomers, let me remind you, as I reminded those who came here earlier, please do remember to turn off the ringers on your telephone. That kind of chaos that you see in Bacon's studio could not have been predicted from his very first work as an artist. This is one of the rare images that survive of his early design work. And some of you who were here yesterday listening to Didier Ottinger's brilliant lecture will know that I've stolen some of his slides because there were too many good points not to reiterate them. But you can see that around 1929, 1930, Bacon was beginning to establish himself not as a painter, but as a designer and decorator of furniture and tapestries, very much in the purist aesthetic of Amédée aux Enfants and, oops, what was that? I think I kicked something. Sorry. We have a loose wire here. I kicked something down here. There we go. Great, thanks. Sorry about that. I must admit, sometimes I miss slide projectors. So to get back to where we were, the very clean, purist aesthetic that we associate with Paris in the 1920s. And indeed, he had been on site in Paris after childhood, partly in rural Ireland, partly in London. He left home when he was 16 years old. His father was dismayed at his homosexuality and turned Bacon over to a family friend who took him to Weimar and made him his lover. And so I think, and to Berlin, where Bacon had a very good time. But by the late 20s, he had begun to be very interested in becoming an artist, finding his way into it first through design. And you get a sense of the early work, which was completely suppressed during Bacon's lifetime. This was only discovered by Christie's auction some years later, this folding screen, that I think you can recognize the influence of Aux Enfants very directly in this work, as well as Picasso's biomorphic surrealist drawings. And indeed, around 1927, Bacon saw a Picasso exhibition at Rosenberg Gallery in Paris, and it was the surrealist inflected images with these strange biomorphic forms inspired by Picasso's own secret liaisons with Marie-Thérèse Walter that put Bacon on the path to becoming an artist. Very few of his first paintings survive, as I mentioned. And this painting from 1933 is one of the only ones that he did not destroy from the 1930s. He was highly self-critical, and you can see that he's gone from the suave elegance of his purist palette to a kind of excavation of the surface, a kind of skeletal imagery, reflection on a crucifixion with the aesthetic closer to artists like Soutine and the Expressionist currents in Paris than anything you could have seen in London art. However, Bacon continued to drift. He never studied. Unlike many of his contemporaries who had formal education, starting with drawing after plaster casts, drawing after the model, working up to painting in the traditional academic methods, Bacon had none of that. He had one or two artist friends who gave him some technical tips, but he basically taught himself how to paint, not often looking at paintings in museums. So there was an anxiety of influence there, but ripping out reproductions from catalogs and working from those reproductions, finding his way forward. Of course, what happened then was World War II. He had survived one war as a child. His father had worked in the War Office in London during World War I, and he spent the 1914 to 1918 under the climate of terror of the First War. But the immediate firebombing of London during the Second War had an even more powerful impact on Bacon and his generation. Indeed, Bacon served as a fire warden, briefly, literally hauling bodies out of buildings like this until his asthma made it impossible for him to continue. There were other artists, of course, trying to depict the war. There was actually an official war office for art that artists like Graham Sutherland and Henry Moore were paid by the government to work in this manner. And they bring a, expressive but essentially journalistic eye to the matter at hand. These are Moore's renditions of families and people huddling in the underground during the bombs. But in 1944, Bacon proposed a very different kind of response to the war, something far fiercer, far more elemental. When it was exhibited in 1945, the shock waves went throughout the entire art establishment, and people loved and hated this painting. It got at a raw nerve, unlike any of his contemporaries. And he continued to excavate that kind of rawness as he moved forward. This painting, literally untitled, just painting from 1946, with this man in a suit covered by an umbrella, standing or sitting before, I should say, a carcass. And we can trace some of these sources. Certainly, Bacon would have known of the slaughtered ox that was in the collection of the Louvre by Rembrandt. That Soutine also had painted slaughtered oxes, as had many members of the Carracci family. You don't need to point to one single source. But also, I think there's a quality of caricature and an economy of line that Bacon got out of political cartoons. And in particular, renditions like this of Neville Chamberlain, the British PM who tried for appeasement with Hitler, disastrously meeting with Hitler in 1938, allowing the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. Once having signed the Munich Agreement, Neville Chamberlain returned to Britain saying, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time." And you can see the bitterness, not only of the immediate caricature by a newspaper artist, where Neville Chamberlain holds up his characteristic umbrella to ignore what is happening behind him. But now this umbrella becomes this canopy and mask for Bacon's figure. And Bacon was very aware of how to craft his own self-image in the wake of the publicity that these paintings drew. And he started working with a portrait photographer called John Deacon at this time. And Deacon photographed Bacon and a number of his friends over the following 2 decades. And here you see Bacon stripped to the waist, holding up 2 carcasses, as if he too is at this point of sacrifice. The flesh is mortal, it can be consumed. He knew how the body came apart after seeing what happened in the bombs of London, as did so many of his contemporaries. And one of the things that often, is raised in regard to Bacon's work was, why was he using Christian imagery when he was a man of Episcopalian background who adamantly said time and again that he was an atheist? But I think for Bacon, he understood that the universal language of Western art and its themes of sacrifice, its crucifixions, its catastrophes, if you will, had a currency that far outstripped any new language that he could bring to his work. And his understanding of the potency of Christian imagery is echoed and then deconstructed and pulled apart, first in the series of heads, and then in these screaming pontiffs based on Velázquez's portrait of Innocent X. And I think this is at the point in his career where he comes closest to the kind of existentialist art that was happening in the hands of another artist he admired profoundly, Diego Giacometti. And these 2 works were juxtaposed most tellingly in an exhibition at the Byler Foundation a couple years ago, head number 4, and then the sort of screaming figure with his extended nose by Giacometti. And here you see Bacon paying very close attention to Giacometti in 1965 when he attended an exhibition of Giacometti's work. And the other thing to keep in mind as foundational themes in Bacon's work is his open statement of queer love in his paintings. Paintings that his dealers found incredibly difficult to exhibit. Indeed, when this painting was featured in an exhibition in New York, it was put on a separate level from the main exhibition gallery. People had to ask to go see it. But Bacon never really discussed what was happening in these paintings because it was plain for the eye to see. But he did source his images from photographs. And whenever possible, when I have an image taken from Bacon's studio, I use those to illustrate these comparisons. And so Bacon was not looking at himself and say with a lover Peter Beard in the mirror so much as taking the poses from Edward Muybridge's Body in Motion series and this page of Wrestlers, which was in Bacon's studio and referenced so often that it became ink-stained and marked by the artist. And now we're back to where our own exhibition begins. And all these themes come together. The idea of love, of sacrifice, of death, of a trinity, an unholy trinity that you see in this painting now called simply Triptych, but was originally titled, when it was first exhibited, Triptych inspired by T.S. Eliot's poem Sweeney Agonistes, made in 1967. This was a subtitle given to the painting by Marlborough Gallery after Bacon admitted that he had been inspired by T.S. Eliot's poem drama about a dysfunctional family plagued by revenge, sorrow, and regret, based loosely on Milton's Samson Agonistes, but also digging further back into ideas of tragedy that touched on Bacon's own great admiration of Greek tragedy as well. Bacon commented on Eliot, "I feel I've always been influenced by Eliot, but I've hardly ever done things directly inspired by particular lines or poems. I admire them, and they excite me, and they goad me to try and work much more. It's the whole atmosphere of it that affects me." But the story told in Sweeney Agonistes is at least in part referenced here as two prostitutes are threatened by a caller, Sweeney, who the name Sweeney, perhaps taken from Sweeney Todd, the demon butcher of Fleet Street, and his own murderous inclinations. And we see in the center a rendition of a murder, not in the bedroom of the prostitutes, but strangely in a train car, the kind of train car that Bacon would have known very well. It is the blue train, or the Train Bleu, that ran from Calais to Monte Carlo, a train route he often followed as he loved going to the big casinos in the south of France. But here now, it's like Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, but instead of being a genteel comedy, it's a scene of butchery. This is a painting that's hard to look at. And indeed, when I was first unpacking it, Gary Tintero said, "Oh, please don't let this be the first thing you see when you walk in the galleries. It's the second thing you see when you walk in the galleries." But I think absolutely essential to our understanding of Bacon and his use again and again now of these wrestling figures that become a cipher, a shorthand, if you will, for male sexual congress. And echoing T.S. Eliot's own lines from the play, which are repeated again and again, birth and copulation and death. That's all the facts when you come to brass tacks. Birth, copulation, and death. That's all, that's all, that's all, that's all. And the idea of death as a performance is further ratified in a series of paintings he did in 1969. We are very lucky to have one of these glorious compositions in our show, Study for a Bullfight. And you see the toreador and the bull in the circular arena. Who is the bull? Who is the toreador? Is Bacon the sacrificial bull that will be killed at the end of the bullfight? Or is he the toreador who controls what's happening in the composition, understanding the risks? And in a very strange allusion, this is taken from a photograph of a Nazi rally. And so this, I think, is Bacon's way of reminding us that these battles are on our doorstep. It is a political reality. I'm going to ask you in the front row to turn off your phone. That's actually very distracting for the people seated behind you. And of course, he's thinking of Picasso again. Picasso was alive. Bacon did not always like his later work, but he was the mountain to climb for Bacon. He was constantly looking at Picasso's work, taking from Picasso not only themes like this, but ways of painting, the twisting forms coming out of Cubism, and then made very personal in Bacon's own distinctive vocabulary. And there's also, I think, a sense of joy. We talk so often about sorrow and sacrifice in Bacon's work, but there's also elation. You have this great triptych, now the first major painting you see as you walk in the exhibition, that celebrates again a new liaison he was having. The exact identity of the figure is not necessarily known, but I love the idea of a swing as a parallel for what can be sexual congress, and the two figures in the center being connected under a single light bulb. And again, the imagery of the swing comes out of, I think, one of Muybridge's funniest sequence of motion studies, where you see a woman trying to get into a hammock. And it's a little hard to see, but unlike the other very serious motion study photographs by Muybridge, you can tell by the end the woman's laughing. She's absolutely giggling from the, getting in and out of the hammock. And I think there is that affirmation in the joy of human connection that you see in Bacon's work. At 1969, 1970, he's starting to prepare for a major exhibition. The Grand Palais in Paris has asked him to do a retrospective, the greatest honor, far outstripping in Bacon's mind any exhibition at the Tate. He didn't want to be known as a London artist. He wanted to be known as a world artist. And the platform offered by the Grand Palais was so much more important. And as Didier pointed out yesterday afternoon, he began to revisit some of his old themes, in part to replace paintings that could not be lent, such as the study of Red Pope, which was not available. So he repainted it, but he thinned it out. He made it more economical. And a lot of people say that the economy that you see in the paintings of the last decade follow the Paris retrospective. But indeed, as he was preparing for the retrospective, he was paring his work down for this very grand occasion. And for example, Cahiers d'Art ran a contest, who is the most important artist working today, in 1971. And Bacon apparently was inordinately pleased that he was higher on the list that year than Picasso. And Bacon was very competitive. He cared enormously about his reputation. And but alas, what was supposed to be a night of celebration turned into also a night of tragedy. Bacon had become alienated from his partner of a number of years, George Dyer. And Dyer insisted on coming to the Paris opening because, as he said, I'm in many of the paintings, but 2 nights before the vernissage, Dyer went back to their shared hotel room and deliberately overdosed on barbiturates for Bacon to find him dead in the room. A terrible shock, one that was not discussed in the public eye until after the opening. But then Bacon retreated to the studio to do this heartbreaking tribute to Dyer, he felt, of course, deeply guilty. We all know about the survivor guilt of anyone who's lost a friend or family member to suicide. Had I been there earlier, had I seen the signs, and indeed Dyer had attempted suicide several times earlier, and this time he succeeded. And what you see here is, again, a wrestling figure, now not as an image of Congress, but a single figure alone, suggested the pool of vomit of someone who has eaten too many barbiturates in his death throes. Here in the center, he is in the hallway of the Hotel Saint-Père, outside the room where he ended his life. And on the right, this sort of double memorial with 2 images in the mirror. And the mirror always was, for Bacon, a metaphor of distance or separation or even death. And Dyer appears in this sort of Jack of Spades double image, looking right, looking left. The central image is very much, again, taken not only from the idea of being on a threshold, as Didier spoke yesterday, and the idea of going from one level of existence to another, i.e., from life to death, but also refers very much to just the ordinary. We go into a hotel room using a key, or key card now, and a reference taken from one of his favorite poems, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where at the end, in the final passage, one of the last sestets reads, "We each think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison." And you can see how realistically captured Dyer is in this image. And Bacon is using one of the photographs taken by John Deacon of Dyer from around 1963. And Bacon commented a number of times on his use of photography. And in 1991, he said, "Here in my studio, there are these photographs scattered about the floor, all damaged. I've used them to paint portraits of friends and then kept them. It's easier for me to work from these records than from the people themselves. That way I can work alone and feel much freer. When I work, I don't want to see anyone, not even models. These photographs are my aide-memoire. They help me to convey certain features, certain details." But now, of course, Dyer is no longer around. He only is alive in memory. And over the following decade, Bacon turns him into his muse, an increasing image of love and regret that he returns to time and again. And this is the second of the great triptychs he dedicated to Dyer. Some of the same imagery, now reframed. You see Dyer clearly on the left, based on photographs that also had been taken by John Deacon in a famous photo session from 1964. Dyer in his tighty-whities posed in the studio. Several different angles that you see here. The creases and tears that you see on the photographs were made by Bacon. He liked to give the photos texture. These were his drawings, if you will, for the paintings that followed. And I'm particularly fascinated by this double exposure where you see Deacon both looking forward and to the side, because in this image from the far right of the triptych, you have Dyer, also as you see in the photograph, but superimposed over that are also Bacon's features. And so he's becoming this sort of double imagery. He is both the victim of the suicide and the man who survived it. And so these kinds of doubling up happen more and more in Bacon's later work. There's a lucidity to the surface of the painting, but an increasing complexity as you begin to read more into them. Here's two paintings we have in the exhibition again. Portrait of George Dyer, painted during Dyer's life, suited in the very expensive Savile Row suits that Bacon liked to buy for Dyer. Dyer himself was from East London. He was barely literate. He was a big hulking guy. Bacon, I think, was sort of hoping he was getting himself a tough lover, but in actual fact, he was getting a very tender and insecure man. And I think that insecurity is reflected in the split reflection there. And commenting on what Dyer was like, Bacon's biographer Daniel Farson recalled, "There was an innocence about George, even a sweetness, which was touching, but his hopelessness made him dangerous. Wearing excellent, soberly cut suits paid for by Francis, he could have been a city businessman until you heard his strangled East End accent." On the right, you see Bacon, now alone, and I keep thinking that this slab of black paint covering whatever could have been on the second chair as a marker of absence. The man who is no longer a part of Bacon's life. And about this time, Bacon declared, "I am determined to get started on painting of my autobiography. I hope to crystallize time in the same way Proust did in his novels." And notice how prominent the watch is on his arm, a very unusual detail for Bacon, who rarely pointed out these kinds of accessories. And in the foreground, the representation of a newspaper with letraset letters printed on, but broken up so that they remain illegible. You can talk about this as a device that goes back to Cubism, and certainly Bacon was thinking of the great Cubist collages of Picasso and Braque from 1913. But I'm also thinking about the ephemerality of the newspaper, something that blows in and is thrown out. And some of you probably know the English expression, yesterday's news is tomorrow's fish and chip paper. That the paper news itself gets outdated. And this is the final of the triptychs dedicated to to Dyer. I keep doing that. There were other triptychs, but we have the three greatest ones in our exhibition. Gary Tintrow described this once, somewhat facetiously, as the worst day on the beach possible. But it is truly about a kind of strange space, a kind of erasure and alienation that it defies logic. And it reminds us that another strong current that Bacon was deeply influenced by was surrealism. And he didn't talk about surrealism as much as he did Picasso, but he comes back to it time and again with these haunting paintings with figures that are lifted from news photographs. This is actually two conservative politicians, Sir Austen Chamberlain here, and then Raymond Poincaré, who are known for their rigorous stance on all issues social. And you could see them as big brother figures looming in the background in judgment. As you see now, Dyer almost unrecognizable, becoming just this cipher, this form, tormented, twisted, under an umbrella. And it's interesting, another source that might not occur to you. If you look at the horses back here, you might possibly think of Degas' racetrack paintings. But there's actually a beach scene that he would have known very well in the collection of the National Gallery in London that most people are quite certain he took inspiration from, although the Degas is quite small and the Bacon is quite large. And you might notice that this has an unusual double date on it. It's not so much that he painted on it for 3 years, but he did have 2 campaigns. And this is what the painting looked like when it was first finished. And we have only somewhat old photography, so the color's off. But in the foreground was an added figure, this strange, hunched figure holding up binoculars. And again, I think it comes out of that sort of big brother atmosphere. And remember, only 10 years before this, anyone engaged in queer sex in England could have been thrown in jail. And this, I think, was a part of the self-consciousness that Bacon always carried with him, although ultimately, as Friend said, that made the painting too literal. It was a stronger composition, empty, and indeed, he removed the figure. And emptiness becomes more and more important to Bacon as he moves forward. He does one last beautiful tribute to Dyer in 1981, 10 years after Dyer's death. This painting wasn't in Paris. We're very lucky to have it here. And just a couple details. For Bacon, that blue band was representing the chasm between life and death. That circle here and here are both halos and images of the mirror of his studio. And you see this very poignant beginning to disappear, the erasure of memory, the erasure of Dyer from the painting, and from finally a sort of farewell after a decade of mourning. And I think, we have other examples of one man mourning the love and loss of another. I'm just pulling this Caravagist image of the death of Hyacinth as one image that would have appealed to Bacon, but not necessarily was a source. But this is an underground history in Western painting. It's not often acknowledged. Bacon begins to, again, as I said, pare away, to think about death, this carcass of meat and bird of prey. When he first exhibited, he said somewhat facetiously to a reporter, "Well, of course we are all meat. We are all potential carcasses. If I go into a butcher's shop, I always think it's surprising that I wasn't there instead of the animal." And of course, again, he's still pulling references out of his own past as he's simplifying his compositions. He's now in his 70s. He's very aware of mortality and legacy. And he's thinking again about, suddenly the word sands of time comes to mind, and I don't mean that. But he starts painting sand dunes, the unstable world around us, that most vulnerable bulwark of land that can be eroded by tide, by time. And he uses these arrows, I think very pointedly, to draw the eye to the composition, but also to sort of then allow a certain distance. I wouldn't say ironic so much as just the here and now. And again, he's thinking a little bit about Degas and Degas' own late landscape pastels, with their own suggestion of the land almost becoming a torso. Again and again, Bacon said his work was not political, but this is one image that, again, we're very excited to have in our show that certainly comes out of the political realm. This is based on a photograph of Woodrow Wilson leaving the Paris peace talks in 1919, the disastrous Treaty of Versailles that ultimately was the architecture of World War II. This is a detail showing the blood-stained desk of Leon Trotsky after he was murdered in Mexico in 1940. And in the middle, you see Bacon's new companion, John Edwards, as this sort of heroic and innocent figure. He's wearing on his shins cricket pads, sort of like a sort of ordinary armor protecting him. And here are the news photographs that Bacon used as source from. And that when I first saw the painting, I thought, there can't be anything in real life that looks like that. There really is. But also, when Didier was talking yesterday about the influence of Marcel Duchamp, I suddenly had this flash that, of course, John Edwards is being recast in a way like a more tactile bride, echoing the bride image of Marcel Duchamp from 1912. Bacon also loved cinema. He loved going to the movies. Many of his early paintings drew inspiration from cinema like that of Battleship Potemkin and others. And there's certainly a cinematic aspect to this street-seeing car in a distance although it was actually based on a news photograph that appeared in the Illustrated London Daily about London in crisis. But it's movies like this. I don't know how many of you remember Anthony Mann's film noir classic Side Street. That I think is what was mostly in Bacon's mind, the sort of, there's been a crime, there's been blood on the pavement. Something has happened here. And he commented at one point that whenever you come across something like this, there's also a strange beauty. When we see red, we recognize it, we think it's beautiful. And as he said, the first thing you think of is its strange beauty, the vision of it, before you think of trying to do anything in regard to seeing a traffic accident. But I also think there's another version of this painting which unfortunately could not travel to Houston, where he simplifies it even further. It's just the dark wall, the blooded pavement, the curbside asphalt. And I cannot help but think of this as something of a critique of Mark Rothko. And Bacon looked very much askance at the abstract expressionists. He called Pollock a lace maker. He wasn't much kinder to Rothko. But I think he really felt that what was the abstract sublime for American artists was for him not enough. It had to have that physical presence. It had to have the body. It had to have the lifeblood in it. We are very fortunate to have this beautiful painting from the Menil, one that again is a simplification of an earlier composition. And again, I think comes much closer to his original inspiration of Picasso and the idea of the figure with a hand at the door with a key. And in Picasso's case, as I mentioned before, it was about his love affair with Marie-Therese Walter, and they used to have rendezvous for sex in cabanas on the beach. And whether that rendezvous is for the same purpose in the Bacon is left open for speculation. But certainly, as Didier pointed out, again, in an analogy so good I couldn't help but bring it back for you today, is this Duchamp image of the door that Duchamp had installed in his studio in Paris, where a door actually served two doorways. One door, he had a carpenter come in, you swing it one way, it closed off one room. You swung it the other way, it closed off a different room. And it was a French phrase that Bacon would have known as well as Duchamp. A door must be either open or shut. And of course, Duchamp's door is always neither. And I think that kind of idea of the threshold and the conundrum and perhaps never getting past that threshold is as interesting to Bacon as anything else. Man at a Wash Basin is another great painting in our exhibition, one that he simplified, we know. Originally, it had a light hanging from a light bulb. There was more definition of the interior space. He, again, coming down to nothingness. The figure is almost begun to be eroded by this wonderful random brushstroke. And there's so many sources now that Bacon just wears lightly. This is a reproduction of a Michelangelo drawing that was in his studio, as well as these Muybridge images of boxers. He's, it's the now, it's the past, it's the old masters. It's my friend having an upchuck after a night out on the tiles. It's all these things at once. And finally, we come to one of, I think, the great self-portraits of all time. He doesn't call it a self-portrait, he just calls it Study for Human Body and Portrait. With a sort of collage aesthetic, although it's all painted, he grafts his own head based on a photograph, here's the photo, over a partial torso. And this was a photograph, we don't know the photographer, taken in the 70s. And the marks and prints from his studio are faithfully reproduced in the painted version. And you see this, haunted figure. He would have been, again, in his 60s when he had this photograph taken, early 60s. He was close to 80 when he made the painting. And so again, these constant temporal slippages, this awareness of time and moving in space, occupy him more and more. And then in this great, one of his truly last triptych, you find another sort of doubling up and referencing, first and foremost, to the George Dyer triptych, but also, and you see here, what in the Dyer triptych, I think was more about the death convulsions of Dyer in 1971, is now become a gentler and happier image of a coupling. And indeed, Bacon was once again in another affair. He was seeing a very handsome Spaniard, a banker, Jose Capello, who you see here. And apparently in the original version of the painting, Capello's features were very, very recognizable. And Capello, being quite well known in the finance world, said, yeah. And so Bacon went back in and repainted, the features somewhat, so it looked more like a racing car driver, Ayrton and Senna, that both of them admired, who they both thought was very sexy. So it's a kind of doubling. It's both Capello, but it's the ideal lover that stands before us here. And Bacon himself is recasting the same pose that you see in the portrait, but now not only has he removed the blemishes of the marks, but he's made himself still younger. He's moving back even further in time, so that this triptych, although there was a 40-year difference between his age and that of his lover, is now come close to equal. And yet, I think very poignantly, we see Capello stepping out of the darkness into our world, yet Bacon is stepping out of our world and into the darkness. This is Bacon's last painting with which we close the show. It is one where he picked up the dust from his studio floor and rubbed it into the canvas. He often liked to say, "We come from dust, dust seems eternal, the one thing that lasts forever, and we all return to dust." Certainly, again, it's a paring down of his original imagery. He's gone through Picasso. He's taken the tauromachia. Is he the sacrificial bull? We don't know. He very rarely talked about the content of his work beyond the superficial. He was a great interviewee. He would charm you. We have a wonderful documentary from the BBC playing in the last gallery, where you can see how he just eats the camera alive. And he chats a great deal, but he remains elusive, and yet the paintings are so generous. They're beautifully made. And I'll close with this beautiful photograph of John Deacon's portrait of Bacon and Dyer in happier days in 1965, with a quote from Bacon: "I just think of life as a moment in which we exist, and all that is there is to it, nothing else. But you do in that moment what you can." Thank you.